Page 61. Black. The cops put me through the system. They took my picture from every side and fingerprinted me. I stayed awake all night in a cell with a bunch of crackheads, afraid to close my eyes on them. There was one toilet in the corner, and everybody could watch you shit and piss. Next morning they shipped me off to the courthouse on Queens Boulevard to see the judge. I spent most of the day in the pens with 100 other guys trying to hold my ground. I had to put on my best ice grill just to get a little bit of space. Some herb got ripped off for his hooded sweatshirt, and if the officers there didn't put a stop to it, he probably would have went out to see the judge in his underwear. I was scared, but I wouldn't show it, or else I would have been shark bait, no matter how big I was. I was wearing my new kicks from the basketball game, and a lot of guys were eyeing them. "He's got the new Nike joints, and they're just my size," somebody said. Those damn shoes got me into this mess, but I wasn't giving anything up to a bunch of thugs. So I stood up the whole time, with all my weight planted on top of them. My stomach was starting to make noise. I hadn't eaten since lunch at school the day before. When they handed out bologna sandwiches with containers of milk, I wolfed it down like I was eating at Red Lobster. Other guys with full bellies wouldn't touch it, and by the time I left to see the judge, the floor was covered with pink bologna. They took me into the courtroom, and I saw my mother sitting with Casey and his wife. It meant something to me that Coach was there for my mother. I didn't hold it against Eddie for not showing. It would have been the same as giving himself up. But right or wrong, I couldn't stop thinking how Eddie was getting a free ride. My mother came up and hugged me tight. I could see in her eyes how she would have liked to break me in half. I met the lawyer the city appointed to my case, Miss Torres. She was talking to my mother before I came out, so my mother knew about everything I did. Miss Torres told me what to expect and asked if I would identify the shooter to get less time. I told her no, flat out. That's when my mother went off. "That's why Eddie's not here. Ain't that right, Marcus? Oh, but he's your best friend in the world, so we'll let you go to jail without him. You just think about—" She caught herself in one quick breath and held the rest back. Then her face turned more serious than I'd ever seen it before. She opened her eyes wide and said, "Marcus, I want to know right now if you've got a gun hidden somewhere in that house. I don't want your sister to find it and blow her head off." I never thought I'd hear her ask me a question like that. "No, Mama," I said in a low voice. Miss Torres just shook her head. The clerk called my name, and it echoed off all four walls. I felt ashamed that my mother had to hear it. The DA came on and said his piece against me. Miss Torres just listened and took notes on her long yellow pad. The judge said there was enough evidence to hold me and set my bail at $20,000. I knew my mother couldn't afford anything close to that. So when it was over, an officer took me back to the pens, and I got put on the next bus to Rikers Island. I was chained to the kid sitting next to me by the wrist and leg. There were thick metal screens on the windows, and the driver was separated from us by a steel cage. The bus turned off the highway and rolled down the side streets, maybe 2 miles from my house. Then it started over the Rikers Island Bridge. There was nothing outside the window, except water and razor wire fenced. Adolescents have their own houses, so the adults can't take advantage of them. I got sent to Mod 1 with all the other New Jacks. That's where they keep you until you learn the system on Rikers. But the main part of what was going on there started to sink in right away. It's black people, wall to wall. There are some Spanish inmates too, but everybody else is black. That whole first night, I kept thinking how if Eddie got arrested with me, his family would have bailed him out. Only I'd still be there. I couldn't beef about it. It wouldn't have been Eddie's fault. That's the way it is. We could be black and white anywhere else in the world, but not on Rikers Island. I saw plenty of white dudes in court. I guess they were innocent or made bail. The only white faces I saw in Rikers belonged to the correction officers. There weren't any cells with iron bars like in the movies. Instead, there were rows of cots in a big dorm. I slept in all my clothes that night, with my head under the blanket. I spent most of the next day feeling my way around. A woman CO put a scrub brush in my hand. I was part of a crew that cleaned the bathroom until it shined. If my mother ever made me do that, I would have blown. But there I was, cleaning the city's toilets without making a peep about it. To get to the mess hall, the officer took us down the main corridor. It's long and narrow, with a low ceiling. The different houses move back and forth on opposite sides, only 5 or 6 feet apart. The COs play the middle in between them. Every time another house passed next to us, kids got tense, like something might jump off. I saw lots of dudes with fresh cuts on their faces, long buck-50s from ear to jaw that would have taken more than 100 stitches to close. I didn't want to become one of them. The COs put us at a table in the middle of the mess hall. The houses all around us knew we were New Jacks and kept barking at us, especially the adults. Most of those dudes were diesel and could have probably snapped me in half. I heard plenty of shit about taking my sneakers, but I just kept eating, like I was deaf. On the way back, the house got stopped at the metal detector. Everybody was patted down. A CO wearing rubber gloves ran his hands down my side and through my pockets. Some kid had snuck out a container of milk, and after the CO found it, he slapped him hard in the back of the head until the kid almost cried. In the house, I was mostly able to hold my own. It was like a summer camp for scumbags. Kids spent all days trying to prove they were gangsters. The sneak thieves stole shit. The Maytags had to wash other kids' socks and drawers. The Dolgers were muscle for the gangsters, and the thugs did their own fighting. But everyone was so scared of being shipped upstate and doing real time with adults. The kids that were ready to cop out looked the most shook. They said the adults upstate didn't play bullshit games. They played for keeps, and you'd have to fight to keep them from being somebody's boy. It got to me, too, and I didn't want to think about doing years up there. At around 5 o'clock, a CO called me out to the front of the house. I was shocked when he told me I was going home on a bailout. I wanted to be off Rikers Island more than anything, but I didn't know how I was going to face my mother at home. An officer took me down to the front gate with my paperwork. My mother and sister were waiting just outside the last checkpoint. It looked like the gates at a subway station, with 2 COs keeping watch. I pushed the bar on the turnstile and felt it come back around and bump me from behind. Sabrina ran up and hugged me. My mother was waiting with her arms folded across her chest. I brought her along because I want her to see what this place is, my mother said before she kissed me on the forehead, without ever opening her arms. We had to take the 101 Limited over the Rikers Island Bridge, past our house to Queensboro Plaza. Then we took the 19A back home from there. My mother walked in tight behind me, like they weren't going to let me on that bus anymore because of what I did. But the driver never said a word. My mother bugged her sisters in New Jersey to put up their house for my bail. They hadn't seen me since I was small, so I knew they did it mainly for her and not me. There wasn't much talk, except for Sabrina. I kept my mouth shut and eyes down for most of the ride. I saw every crack in the sidewalk and every piece of trash on the floor of those buses. Moses and X were hanging out right outside my building. They both gave me a pound with my mother watching close. No matter what, they still got to prove their case against you, X said. And they get it wrong a lot, brother. Moses said how much the team missed me in the second half. Then he gave X a sideways look and said, "Your best friend took a scholarship to St. John's before he left the gym that night." They waited for me to blink. And I won't front. It hurt like anything to hear. But I had bigger things to worry about, so I brushed it off. My mother heard every word. She was so steamed at it you could have fried an egg on her forehead, but she didn't blow either. We got into the elevator and the metal door sprung closed behind us. My sister had to jump up a little to hit the top button. We started up and I could feel the pressure pushing down on me. Felt like my heart was sinking into my shoes. My mother put the key in our door and opened the locks one by one. I was never so glad to be home in all my life, but another part of me knew what I was in for that night, and I would have rather been caught stealing money out of my mother's purse than tell her everything I had done. Sabrina turned on the TV, but my mother shut it back off inside the first minute. She told my sister to study her math and clean up for dinner. It was a knock at the door. My mother shot me a hard look, so I didn't even think about moving. She opened the door without even asking, "Who is it?" Mrs. Johnson from downstairs was standing there with a pot of stew. She used to be my babysitter. Now she stayed with Sabrina when my mother got outside sewing jobs. They stood at the door and talked about me like I wasn't even there. "So how is he?" she asked. "He's still on this earth, if that's what you mean," my mother answered. Mrs. Johnson almost laughed and said, "Hold on to that kind of thinking, honey. It'll help you get through this." The stew was the only real food I had in almost 2 days, but I didn't enjoy a bite. It was almost 8 o'clock when we finished. I carried the dishes to the sink and started to wash them. Then my mother told Sabrina to go to bed early and went to talk to her. I heard my mother's footsteps darting back, and I scrubbed the dishes even harder. She pulled the chair out and sat down at the table behind me. I didn't want to turn around for anything. I kept at the dishes until they were whiter than they'd ever been. "That's enough of that. Come over here and sit down," my mother said. Her eyes were more sad than angry. We looked at each other for almost a minute without saying a word. "Explain yourself to me, Marcus," she finally said, her voice shaking. Before the first word came out of my mouth, I broke down crying. I looked up and she was crying too. "I just wanted some extra money, Mama. I wanted to do things. I wanted to buy these shoes and pay the senior dues. I didn't mean for anybody to—" "You almost killed somebody. Do you understand that? You threw away your life for some spending money and a pair of shoes, and you almost killed a man," she said. "Now did I raise you up, or did the streets?" She kept on through the tears. She asked me why I wouldn't say Eddie's name. She knew he was there with me and must have had the gun. "Maybe you won't say his name to the police, but you'll say it here. I don't want to hear any more of this I business because I know it was we. It's black and white until somebody's ass is on the line. And when it's time to go to jail, it's just black. He'll find a new boy to carry his bags in college, and you'll be an ex-con on the unemployment line," she screamed. Sabrina came out of the bedroom crying from all the yelling. My mother held her tight and buried Sabrina's face in her chest. "I love my babies," she said, rocking her. "Lord knows I love my babies." After everything got said out loud, I went to my bed. I thought about Eddie and what my mother said. If Eddie had got bagged without me, I don't know how I would have been acting. I just know I would have been keeping a low profile too. You don't give your best friend up to the cops. No how, no way. I knew that Eddie would have played it the same way for me, but that part about the scholarship was sticking in me. The phone rang. It was like someone sent an electric shock through me. I was sitting up in my bed before the second ring. That's when my mother answered. "Yes, he's home, but he's asleep now. It's been a long couple of days," she said. Then she asked, "How's your brother taking all this?" And I knew it was Rose calling. "No, I can't talk to him right now, dear, but you let your brother know from me that God has a way of watching over things." "Yes, you too. Good night." And I heard her put the phone down in the cradle. The next morning, my mother was standing over me, poking my shoulder to get up. She was sending me to school. I took a shower and got dressed. There was oatmeal on the kitchen table, but no place set for me. "You're going to start doing things for yourself more. Get a bowl and spoon," she told me. When I was finished, I went to scrape the last of the oatmeal into the garbage. My new sneakers were sitting right on top, covered in table scraps. Smell came up and hit me good. I just froze there for a second, sick to my stomach. I pushed what was left in my bowl right on top of them and closed the lid down tight. I kissed my mother before I left for school. She stood there like a stone statue. When my lips were on her cheek, I could feel everything warm inside her. But once I came off, she was cold as anything to me again. I turned the corner outside my building and thought about what I should do. I took 2 or 3 steps towards school, then I stopped. I spun around quick and felt enough momentum to keep going towards Eddie's. I waited across the street, at the end of the block, behind a thick tree. There were shadows moving inside the house. Rose walked out with her arms folded around a notebook. I called her name the second she stepped outside the gate. Her mouth opened wide, but I put a finger over my lips for her not to make a sound. She looked back towards the house, then she ran over to me. Rose said my name and hugged me at the same time. Then she told me what everyone was saying I got arrested for. "You didn't do any of that, Marcus, did you?" she asked. I told her it was an accident that the man got shot, but I could see in her brown eyes how disappointed she was in me. Rose wanted to know why I didn't just come to the door. I asked her what her mother and father thought about me getting locked up. She dropped her shoulders and said they were both down on me. That's when Eddie stepped outside. He stood there looking at us while he put another arm through his coat. I never saw Eddie walk with his arms so stiff, but he put both of them around me before I could lift mine to hug him back. I told him I'd heard about the scholarship. He said that wasn't important, but we'd both be playing in college soon, maybe even together. I didn't believe that, and it didn't sound like Eddie did either. Then Eddie asked me about court, and I just held on to myself tight. Part of me wanted to spark off about what I was facing alone now, but I couldn't go there in front of Rose. "How stressed is your mother?" Eddie asked. I looked over Rose's head and caught Eddie's eye. "She's all over everything in this," I said, and watched his face drop straight off. Then Rose asked how I could get talked into something like that. She said how it wasn't right that whoever did the shooting was off the hook, and that I had to pay for it all. I fought hard to keep my voice even. "That's just the way the game gets played out," I said. "The cops do the chasing. It's all about who they catch." The school block came up fast. We took our ID cards out and passed through security. 2 of the school safety officers, Jefferson and Connolly, were at the front desk. They worked security together at all our home games. Kids called them black and white wannabes, but they always just smiled at that and did their jobs. Jefferson was tall and lean. He played football and basketball when he was a high school kid in Brooklyn. Connolly was almost a head shorter and weighed close to 300 pounds. His nose was pushed flat like a pig's, and if you ever ranked on him about it, he'd make sure you got suspended the same day. He could be all right, but he had a mean streak in him too. One day, Connolly went out and bought a brand new basketball and football for Eddie and me to sign. We knew we wanted them to sell one day, but that didn't matter. Those were our first autographs. Connolly took the ID out of my hand. He looked at it like he'd never seen me before. Then he turned to Jefferson and asked, "Do you want to buy a half a basketball cheap?" Jefferson didn't crack a smile at that or anything, but when I passed through, Jefferson tapped me on the shoulder and said he wanted to talk to me about everything later. When we got out of range, Eddie called Connolly an asshole and Rose backed him up on it. Deep down, that made me feel better. Eddie's class was on the first floor. Mine was on the third, the same as Rose's. Halfway up the stairs, Rose said, "I know the 2 of you keep that game face on all the time and pretend it's all okay, But I can't even imagine what you're feeling, Marcus. It's been tough on Eddie too, worrying about you. I heard him crying in his room. It must be 100 times worse for you. All morning kids wanted to know what happened. I just played it cool and told them I couldn't talk until everything got straightened out in court. They figured I must have been innocent. Everybody knew I had it going on playing ball. They couldn't see me throwing it all away on a lousy stick-up. I was copying the English notes I'd missed when Eddie walked through the door. His face wasn't showing much of anything. He nodded his head to me. Then Mrs. Sussman started her lesson, and Eddie turned back around. He didn't take his eyes off her for the rest of the period. When the bell rang, Eddie pulled his books together one at a time. He stood up and waited for me. "Coach will probably run us like dogs today with that game on Tuesday," he said. Would have done anything to hear what was really inside his head. He even had to punch him in the jaw to get it out. I pushed my toes in the floor and said, "I wasn't even thinking about that right now." I went out the door first with Eddie right behind me. Before I knew it, I was headed to my next class alone. Later on, I ran into Eddie's mother in front of the cafeteria. "Rose told me you were here this morning," she said. "I just want you to know that if you can't talk at home, you can come by our house and say anything that's on your mind, Marcus. I want you to know that we're always going to be there for you." I looked into her eyes and knew how bad she'd feel if she ever found out about Eddie. "Thanks, but I'll get by all right," I told her. The noise inside the cafeteria hit me like a wave. Moses and X found me sitting by myself. They were all over me for pulling a stick-up on somebody who could point me out so easy. Then they pounded me about messing up my shot at playing college ball. "So the dude didn't remember what your partner Al Capone looked like?" asked Moses. "Of course not," cracked X. "He was so shocked the black kid wasn't the one holding the gun he couldn't take his eyes off Marcus." No matter how bad they got on my case, at least it was real. "You don't have a paid lawyer. You don't have a co-defendant to take half the blame. You're fucked," X said. "The only thing in your favor is the dude who got shot is black. The judge won't give a damn unless the judge is black too," said Moses. All through math class, I only saw the back of Eddie's head. The teacher gave a pop quiz. I ran through it easy because they were questions we had from the beginning of the year. I could see Eddie was stuck on the last problem. I thought about kicking his chair twice for the letter B, but my leg wouldn't move. We walked upstairs to practice together and started to change. The last time I was in that locker room, the cops were handcuffing me. Now I didn't have anything to hide except for Eddie's part. Eddie saw me lacing up my old kicks and asked about my sneakers. "My mother chucked the new ones in the garbage," I told him. He stood there looking at me until his eyes dropped down to his own shoes. Coach was all over everybody at practice for making little mistakes or not hustling. I only screwed up one time, but when I did, Casey jumped on me too. Felt good to take the heat for something small again, like screwing up on a basketball court. After I caught my first wind, I fell right in step. The ball was moving back and forth between Eddie and me like nothing ever came between us. We had guys flying in every direction. No one could read our moves. And every time they tried to double team one of us, the ball got passed quickly to whoever was open. I blocked everything else out of my mind and just played ball. Then Casey blew the last whistle. I was drenched in sweat. I didn't want to towel off. I wanted to keep playing. Eddie and everyone else went into change, but I just kept shooting the ball by myself. It was the first time I could remember that Casey didn't give us his Friday speech about keeping out of trouble over the weekend. By the time I went inside, Eddie was already dressed, so I threw sweats and a jacket on over what I was wearing. Neither one of us said a word until we got down the stairs into the door to the school slammed shut behind us. We were at the first corner waiting for the light to change when Eddie asked, "Is there something I'm supposed to do?" "There's nothing to do," I came back. "That man recognized me, and now I gotta deal with it." "How rough was it?" Eddie asked. I told Eddie the cops had me sewed up tight from the beginning, but I wouldn't tell them anything more. Then Eddie said he dumped the gun where nobody would ever find it. He didn't say where, and I didn't ask. I told Eddie how my mother knew from the start it was him with the gun, but I didn't think I could get across how mad she was, so I didn't even try. "I only took that scholarship right away in case they started to hear things later," he said. "When shit jumps up, I guess you gotta move fast," I said. "I'll be playing somewhere, too, after the judge and my mother finish kicking my ass." We stopped a few blocks from our house. I asked Eddie if he was worried about being seen with me in the streets. The cops might figure it out for themselves. He thought about it for a few seconds and said, "Who doesn't already know about black and white?" We both smiled at that and went home our separate ways.